In this next section, we're going to take a look at what happens when you multiply a function by a constant. In the last section, we looked at adding and subtracting constants, and in this section, we're going to take a look at multiplying. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is what happens when we multiply by -1. So again, we're going to use Desmos, and we're going to compare the graphs of the functions f of x is equal to 2 to the x, that'll be our base function. And then the first transformation we'll look at is f of x is equal to -2x. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the output by -1, and we're going to see what happens. So let's take a look. Okay, so we're going to come to Desmos, and here's our base function, f of x is equal to 2 to the x. So the next function we're going to graph is f of x is equal to -2 to the x, so multiplying the output by -1. And we can see what's happened is the original function has been reflected over the x-axis. So if we take a look here, we can see that the red original function has been reflected over the x-axis to form this green function or this dark function going down. Okay, so multiplying the output by -1 has reflected our function about the x-axis. So let's go ahead and record that in our notes. All right, so multiplying the output by -1 has resulted in a reflection of the function graph over the x-axis. The next transformation we're going to look at is what happens when we multiply our input by -1. So remember, our input is x. So what happens if we multiply x by -1? What is the graph of f of x equals 2 to the -x going to look like? All right, so let's take a look at that. So here's our original function, and what we're going to graph now is f of x equals 2 to the -x. So we can again see that it's a reflection, but this time, instead of reflecting over the x-axis, the reflection has been about the y-axis. So you can imagine if you were to take this graph and fold it along the y-axis, those graphs would be identical. All right, so multiplying by -1 results in a reflection about an axis. If you multiply the input by -1, like we have here, we have a reflection about the y-axis. And if you multiply the output by -1, like in our first example, you have a reflection about the x-axis. So let's go ahead and record that in our notes. So when you multiplied the input by a -1, it ended up as a reflection of the graph about the y-axis. So what happens if you multiply by numbers which are non-negative? What happens if you multiply by positive numbers? And again, it's going to depend on whether you're multiplying the input or the output by that number. If you multiply the output of a function by a constant, it's going to stretch or compress the function. So I have some pictures here of an original function, and when we multiplied it by 2, notice that the function got stretched vertically. So when you multiply by a constant greater than 1, you have a vertical stretch. And if you multiply by a number less than 1, for example, here's 0.5 times the function, you can see that it got squished down, so it got compressed. So it's a vertical compression, meaning the function got smushed or squished down. Okay? So what finally, our last one would be, what happens when you multiply the input of a function by a constant? Okay, so if you multiply the input by a constant, again, it also stretches or compresses, but instead of compressing or stretching vertically, it stretches or compresses the function horizontally. So let's look at this picture. If you multiply by a number greater than 1, so for example, multiplying by 2, if you multiply by 2, this is our original function right here. This is f of x is equal to x squared. And when we multiplied by 2, the function got compressed. It got squished in. But when you multiply by a number less than 1, like here we're multiplying by 0.5, you can see that this red graph is gotten stretched. It's gotten pulled out. So multiplying by a number less than 1 stretches your function. And again, this is in the horizontal direction. All right? So multiplying by a positive number, the output by a positive number stretches it vertically. Go ahead and fill that in. And multiplying the input of a function stretches or compresses the function horizontally.